How are we doing? Much better now. Okay, we can see you. Cool. Okay, hello everyone. Sorry about that. I have no idea what's going on. David's mentioned there was a YouTube problem. But anyway, so we're back. Hello. Something weird there. So let's get started again. So for completeness, we are in 13.1.3. Sorry, everyone. So 13.1.3 is the current latest version of Capture One, which is version 20.1.3 from a marketing point of view. And of course, the big news at the moment is that going forward, we are going to switch at some point in the future to version 21. So version 21 is what Capture One have been, let's call it, drip feeding out some of the updates for. And version 21 includes some extra things. So we've got on there speed edit. We've also got on there dehaze. We've also got on there pro standard camera profiles, Mac support natively in M1. And a load of other good stuff, and some stuff still to come. So it was a sneak peek version 2. If you didn't see last night's one, which covers dehaze, then please have a look at the YouTube link that's on the bottom of that screen right now. Now, when we covered dehaze, some of you will know, I started talking about this just before, some of you will know that we have a little bit of a discrepancy between my view on dehaze and the fact there's a dehaze tool. The two actually go quite well together. So in my head, dehaze is something that I can do very easily manually using a lot of the tools that are in Capture One, and that's where the power of Capture One comes into its own. But outside of that, a lot of people struggle with it, and it's also quite a painstaking process to get right. It's quite a few different sliders you need to play with to get things sorted out. So what the dehaze tool does, and what it's very good at doing, is getting you to sort of 80% very quickly. From there, you can then move things along and you can try and enhance the image with extra sliders and extra adjustments, which is great. So as a starter for 10, the dehaze tool will get you to, let's call it 80%, but whatever you want to call it, something that's pretty good, pretty clear, pretty sharp, and you've got rid of a lot of the haze issues. And from there, we can then tweak. So I would look at dehaze just like I would the contrast slider, just like I would the highlight recovery tool, and so on. All these things can be done in YouTube. They are in YouTube, in curves, in levels, in lots of other tools that are in Capture One, if you want to spend the time doing it. And you can possibly get better results by doing it manually. But if you want a quick method of being able to cut through the haze in a shot, then that's exactly what the dehaze tool is for. Okay, so sorry, the reason that I said YouTube in there is some of you still say you're having a couple of problems with YouTube. The problem is there's a bit of a mix. So some people are having a problem, some people aren't. Bit of a confusing message, unfortunately, but hopefully we're going to get a little bit better as we go along. So next bit of news before we go anywhere else is we have obviously the competition that we were running. So the win a version or an upgrade to version 21 of Capture One. That ended on the 22nd of November, which was last week, and David and I spent a little bit of time going through, well, quite a lot of time actually, going through the winners, but actually the final 9, the final 50, we got over 100 and something, 160 something entries in, which is great. What was really good is we get to see how many of you are doing things like layer adjustments and local adjustments and using HDR tools and doing all the stuff with curves and levels. So it's great to see everything that you guys were sending in. And some of the images were stunning. So without further ado, let's go on. We got down to, let's call it this, a final 9. So if you see your picture in here, well done. You made it to the final 9 images that David and I went through in detail. In terms of the before and after. Let's just load that up so you can see. And these were truly some great edits. But obviously we have to get down to a winner. And we have managed to do that in terms of this shot from or Narayan, or Narayan. Sorry, Nar. You actually sent in your emails saying, call me Nar, it's easier. So Nar's shot out in the fields. Now, what's really cool with this shot is if you look at the original, which is in the bottom right, it actually used the healing brush to remove not only one of the animals, but actually build a new set of foliage in there. So as a base edit and the crop that was wanted, this is much improved. but more importantly, it's color graded. So when I look at the layers in this shot, there's actually a lot of thought that was put into making this shot feel different from the originals. The original was quite cold, quite flat sky and so on. The new version, or the edited version, was a lot more rich. We've got a lot of local adjustments in there. And even things like over the top of the animal, we've got extra bits of light added in. We've got some dodging and burning. Really good job now. Really loved it. So for that, we're sending you a styles pack. We'll get in touch. You get your styles pack of your choice, but well done. And then we come on to the winner. So the winner we actually struggled with. And the reason we struggled with was because there were two shots that were equally good. And we've actually made a bit of a weird decision. So winner number one, we're going to have two winners. So both people will end up with a Capture One version 21 upgrade or an extra year added on to your subscription. So winner number one is Peter. So this shot from within some sort of cave. Again, we'll go into the detail of it at some point. We might actually talk about it on the Facebook group. But this shot has so many different elements to it to make it look alive, but also make it look natural and make it look realistic. So what we don't want to see in these shots is that ultra bold, vibrant, over-the-top version of editing. What we want to see is true, natural edits that are actually real and generally more realistic. I'm just seeing, sorry guys, I'm just seeing more comments. I think YouTube is having a massive problem at the moment. So we've got people in the UK with problems. We've got people in Germany with problems on YouTube, but Facebook is okay. There's something very odd going on. I'm sorry, guys. And I'm not sure whether or not we can fix it. So we're going to carry on. And if anything, we can always put this up online for people to view later. So this shot here, which is Peter's shot, great work, Peter. Really well done. The amount of layers in this, the amount of care that was taken, even things like back in the far distance of the cave, some highlight correction to bring back some of the detail. All of that stuff was really good. And we've got that iridescent glow of the water down below. So Capture One version 21 license heading your way. Well done. And then we'll move on to winner number two. So winner number two is Noel. So this is a shot which actually, on the face of it, looks like quite a simple edit. So if in theory you could have used clarity to just pump a load of contrast into this and make everything look more dramatic and more rich and deep and so on. But there's a problem with doing that. You would end up with halos everywhere. You would end up with over-sharpening pieces. You'd end up with noise and all the other stuff. So this edit actually is a lot more complicated than you'd realize until you look at the layers in this. So what Noel has done is brought out all of the drama in the sky without any of the artifacts that we talk about that make an image look pretty rough if you overdo them. The tree has got a huge amount of detail in it, but it's not overdone. It's still rich. It's still got its color in it. The sky has still got color and contours in it, but it's added in a load of drama. And if I look from the original across to the edit, it's not, again, it's not overdone, but it is dramatic and it is a great edit from what was done. So we've got our three winners, as it were, in the competition. So number one, Nars shot out in the fields. Well done. Styles pack heading your way. We will send one across. Winner number one, so first winner is Peter. Peter's shot, he wins his Capture One version 21 upgrade. We'll organise that, whether it's a subscription or a perpetual license, we'll make that work. And winner number two, Noel's shot of a tree with a, someone told me this, it's something, there's something special about a plume of water coming down. It's like a water typhoon or something like that. There's a special word for it. Anyway, well done. So everyone there, and actually to the final 9, again, all of these, they were difficult to choose from. Each of them had great aspects in their own right, and we really struggled with the final 2, and hence we ended up with 2 winners rather than 1. But well done, everyone. So with that all done and with that all said, let's get on to editing today. There we go. Let's start off with Alan's shot. So this is New Mexico, if I remember correctly from what he said. So this shot, this is actually the edit that Alan's done. And if I go back to the original, it's obviously a lot less rich and not quite so vibrant. And I'm just going to sort of peel back some of the edits in this because there are some issues with some of these things that have been pushed a little bit too far, and I'll show you what they are. So first off, if I look at our original here, and let's just go on to our lens profile. So we always start on this tab. We make sure that we've got the right lens loaded in. If we don't, we use a manufacturer profile. And if we don't have that, then we'll go on to generic. So this one is loaded in the correct profile, the Sony FE lens. At f9, we might have a bit of diffraction. We're probably okay, but let's just turn that on. And let's have a look at what's happened in this edit. So out here, we've got a bright area in the middle, and it gets darker as it goes to the outside. In the edit, for some strange reason, we've ended up with darkness in the middle and lightness on the outside. Now, David and I, funnily enough, actually saw this in some of the competitions entries that came in. As a bit of a warning, the light fall off down here. The temptation with all these sliders is to always push them to the max. So fix distortion completely, fix sharpness completely, and so on. The challenge with doing that is the light fall off one actually goes beyond 100. So if I undo light fall off, so this lens has some vignetting, and the edit itself has actually lent itself to having even more darkness around the outsides of the frame. But the light fall off slider is designed to fix any lens vignetting up to a certain point. But if you push it too far, it doesn't just fix the vignetting, it actually makes the outside even brighter than it should have been in the first place. So this one was pushed to 120, which actually means we end up with a bright area on the outside and a darker area on the inside, which doesn't always make sense visually. So on this one, I'm just going to dial that back a little bit and just get some more even tone around the image. Now, the effect of that is because we've darkened everything down, all the added contrast and added saturation that Alan's put into this shot then starts to become a little bit overpowering, and we're going to go in and try and address that. The second thing that I see immediately on this, if I just zoom in up here, is we've got this weird shape here going on the outside of these rocks. And actually, if I look in here really carefully, we've got some of these little squiggly bright pixels going on in there. Now, some of this we could say is down to purple fringing, but it's not actually in this case. It's more likely that in one of the layers we've got some over sharpening going on or some over clarity going on. So let's just have a little look at some of these different layers. So color sky, no issue. And actually a quick way of looking at this is if we turn the layer off. So the color sky has pumped the saturation for sure. It's pumped a lot of the color. It's probably been done. If I have a look in our color editor, yeah, there we go. So we've taken the blue and we've taken the pink, and they've been pushed quite a long way up in saturation. I'd be tempted to pull them back just a touch, just because actually in saturation slider terms, these are actually really powerful sliders. You can really push an image a bit too far if you really push it too much. So beyond that, let's just have a look now at whether that's fixed up here, and it probably hasn't. Not quite. So it's not that layer that's causing our issue. So let's move on. Let's look at our global layer. So that hasn't done it there, but the global layer is generally just adding in an extra set of richness and probably some contrast in here. So yeah, so pull down the highlights, pull down the black, so we're making the darks even darker, the shadows a little bit darker as well. So that's all good. Color verticals, yeah. So that's these parts here, and what we've got on here is probably another, so another color editor wheel, and again that saturation pushed up a bit too much. It just feels a little bit too much, and actually there's a hue shift in here that's made it a bit greener than reality, so I'd be tempted to pull that hue back a little bit. So from yellow, your hue is going to go positive, it's going to go into green, negative, it's going to go into a more reddy orangey color, and that's probably where we want to get to. Okay, so that's our vertical one. Then the color flat tops, we've got another color editor layer in here, and I'm guessing it's these ones. So let's turn this off. Yep, so we've basically taken the red and we've increased some saturation, darkened them down so they're just a bit more rich. Let's take our floor. Let's have a look at what that's done. So that's just darkening and getting more detail into the floor. Good move. And our sky overall. Now this, you can see, is where we're seeing some of this stuff creep in. So I love the name of the layer, not sky details. So in other words, in this layer, we've got extra detail and clarity going on, but not the sky. And if I turn the mask on, we can see it's everything but the sky. So probably a good move. We don't want to introduce detail and noise in the sky. But it's this sky layer that's a bit of a problem. And what's happened is it's this negative clarity here. So if you have a look here at this boundary, if I just turn this sky layer off, you'll see all of these issues start to disappear. But the problem is that the sky layer exists because what Alan's wanted to do is darken down that sky in general. So the highlight correction here, not a problem. And actually, if I zoom in up here and turn off our highlight quickly, there, that's not making much of a change to these artifacts up here and this border sort of margin with a bit of a halo around it. But what is causing a problem is this negative clarity. And the reason is because this mask goes right up to the border. Now, this can be a bit of a problem because what clarity does, and it's a bit of a, let's call it a nuance with clarity. Clarity, remember, is looking for areas of contrast to be able to increase, normally around the midtones. It's a midtone primarily adjustment tool. But it's looking for where areas change from bright to dark and dark to bright. And it takes the darker one and makes it darker, and it takes the brighter one and makes it even brighter. And that's how you get the effect of a micro contrast adjustment. So that's all well and good on the bit that is masked. But what happens with clarity on the areas, the boundaries where a mask stops, it still looks slightly outside and it still makes a change right on that boundary line. So what's happening here is this minus clarity and minus structure is doing a good job of smoothing the sky down. Let's just go over to the sky here. If I were to temporarily undo and redo, I can see in the sky, you might not be able to see on YouTube, and I know for some of you the connection's not great either, I'm afraid. But I can see there are some patterns in there, and then the second I release this and put the negative clarity back on, it smooths out the sky. But we need that mask to come away from this edge. Now the problem with the mask coming away from that edge, let's just show you, the second I start to erase it, let's just do a quick one, full opacity, let's erase that mask. Great, we've fixed the edge problem, but what we haven't fixed now obviously is because this layer was also doing the HDR fix, it was pulling down the highlights. So what we actually need is two separate masks. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer, and we're going to call it Sky Clarity. And this layer we're going to rename as Sky HDR. I'm going to use on the Sky Clarity the same mask as the one that we had from the original Sky HDR. So I'm going to copy mask from Sky HDR. So now I've got another layer with exactly the same mask that the other one had. But on this layer, I'm going to pull down clarity and structure just like before. On this one, I'm going to undo the clarity and structure. So we now have one layer, Sky HDR, which is just doing the highlight adjustment, and one layer called Sky Clarity, which is just doing the clarity adjustment. And on the clarity one, I'm going to delete some of the masked area as it gets nearer to the rocks along here. And what we're going to find is that's going to fix that ghosting and that shadowing without changing our highlight reduction. So we used the highlights still, the highlight reduction, that's still on Sky HDR, that's still got the highlights pulled down. In fact, we could even use our exposure tab if we want to pull that down even more. There is, funnily enough, a little bit of a gap up here on it, I think. So if I put my mask on, yeah, we've got a little bit of an issue there where actually we've got a slightly lighter mask than the rest of it as we get nearer to these rocks. So let's just fill that in around the edge. You can see a bit more of a halo around it otherwise. So be careful with that if you're using the edges of a mask, that it doesn't taper off near the edge. That should be done there. That's looking a bit better. So we go from having all of it with a couple of halos around it to still a couple of little bits here, which is a bit weird. So is it the clarity bit that's in there? It could be. Let's just have a look at our mask. Oh yeah, because I didn't delete it from up there. So let's finish that deletion job on the clarity layer. Let's just take that out of there. All good. Now, what this means is the bits that we've used negative clarity to smooth the sky are not going to apply down here near to the rock. But the effect overall is better because we don't have those weird halos appearing up there in the sky. So effectively, this just means we've separated that layer out. So the layer was doing two things. It was fixing the brightness of the sky, it was bringing it down, and it was reducing clarity from the sky to smooth it out. The problem with that is both of those things, when they get near to the edge of a rock, the clarity one is going to start having problems, but I need the HDR one to go near the rocks. So we need to separate the two out. So we now have one mask that goes near the rocks, that's doing our HDR or our pull down of exposure, and one mask that stops short of the rocks, this one, which is doing an awful lot less as we get nearer to the rock, but it's still smoothing out the sky just the way that Alan wanted beforehand the second we get further away from it. As long as I have a margin before the next different area of contrast, clarity isn't going to do anything crazy. Okay, so let's have a little look at another shot, I think, from Alan in here. I just want to show. So from my point of view, that's probably where we're going to get to. It's not quite as bold, not quite as saturated as the original in there, but to me, I prefer it where we don't have it getting brighter as we get to the outside. It's going to be a bit more of a challenge to look at. It just doesn't quite make sense when it gets darker in the middle. Williams just asked, what about using a luminosity mask? So the luminosity mask will work, but again, all you're going to do there is pick up a mask that's really, really close to those rocks. The second I start playing with clarity on a border, you're going to get that weird halo effect. So the luminosity mask will help you get a nice accurate mask. To be fair, Alan's actually already done a pretty good accurate mask over the sky in there. In fact, it has a luma range on it, to be fair. The issue is that getting closer to that boundary here, the second I start playing with clarity on this layer, that boundary is going to cause some halos, especially when we're at plus or minus 100 in clarity. If we're at plus 20, minus 20 or whatever, it still happens, but you just don't see it as much. The second you're up at 100, you're going to notice anything wrong to a massive extent. Okay, next one. Let's have a little look up here. So another shot from Alan. Again, this location is stunning. It's wonderful. I really like the rocks and the sunsets and stuff. Here's our original. And then here we go through to our final edit that Alan sent in. I love the toning of this shot. I love the fact that you've used all the recovery that you could. So in the foreground, you've pulled up all of that high dynamic range that the camera actually had. So this isn't a blend of more than one shot. This is genuine dynamic range from within the camera. We've got all this detail that previously was lost in shadow. It hasn't come up that much with much noise in terms of any defects that come as a result of lifting the shadows. So that's pretty nice. We've got a little bit of fringing up here, so I'm going to go onto my my lens panel and just tick this or push the purple defringe up. That's going to especially affect areas of high contrast. So whenever you're in a place where there's a shadow followed by a very bright sky somewhere else, that's going to be the issue that you encounter. So that's what the purple defringing tool is there to counter against. I'm going to turn on diffraction correction, which might sharpen up some of these edges a little bit. But here's the challenge. Up here in the sky, now this is what happens. Let me just show you on the layer. I think it's the sky grad, yeah. So on our sky grad, we've pulled down highlights, we've pulled down whites, we've pulled the exposure down, that's all great, and there's nothing else on curves. In our color editor, we've done a little bit of work here in terms of pushing up the saturation of blue, pulling down the lightness. We've got the same with this sort of purpley color as well. Push the saturation up a lot. Pushed up the brightness, but not quite as much as the previous one. The effect, unfortunately, is that you end up with these flattened areas here. So you see how this cloud is no longer a sort of 3D shape. It's a very flat color. And that happens especially when we start doing things like pulling down high dynamic ranges to their maximum in an area where you've got a mix of contrasts around the midpoint. So one question, sorry guys, I've missed some of the questions because I was a bit concerned about the connection. So someone trying to convince me that the gamma slider in levels is the same as using the contrast slider in exposure. Thoughts? No. And in fact, thank you, David, because David's already got there. Nope, it's not the same thing. So the contrast slider, literally, if you think about it in this term, it draws a line down the middle of the histogram and it says, if you're brighter than me, then get brighter still. If you're darker than me, then get darker still. The midpoint in your levels tells Capture 1 where the midpoint should be. So in other words, you're telling Capture 1 where the 128 point should be. So if this is 0 and this is 255, the midpoint is 128. Effectively, it's changing the mix of how much dark stuff do you want out of your histogram or how much light stuff do you want. So the closer this gets to here, the more of the light stuff I'm pumping into the image. The closer I get to the highlight end, the more of the dark content I'm pumping into the image. That's the way that we look at it. Okay, so where are we? It's almost like you don't need an HDR blending. Oh, David doesn't learn. Duck. So the camera has a huge amount of dynamic range, absolutely. And actually, to a certain extent, you don't necessarily need HDR blending to get the best out of it. I'm not a fan of HDR blending. However, if you push these sliders too much, you will get the effect of flattening stuff down. And equally, if we push these too much, especially on the color editor, and it's especially, I think, on this one here, what we end up with is losing some of the texture and everything that's in those clouds. So there's a lot more detail in there that we're not necessarily seeing, because once you start pushing these sliders a bit too much, we end up flattening those areas. You end up flattening the colors. And it's actually, funnily enough, we looked at it yesterday in the dehaze demo. If we pick on the wrong shadow tone for haze, you can end up with an effect where you just take a whole block of very different, subtly different colors and tones, and it just becomes flat, because Capture One's going to say, okay, well, this block of the curve, effectively, what you want me to do is just darken it, so I will. So if you use these sliders too much, and you pull back too much overall, you're going to end up with a lot of these issues where you get false colors or flattened areas where it's just a bit overdone, and that's going to be a challenge, especially when you layer them one on top of the other. As you go 1, 2, 3, 4 on top and start stacking layers, I'm just checking that we haven't got any other color balance changes in there. As you start stacking these changes, so let's say we've done a full highlight recovery and then we do a massive contrast adjustment, then we do a massive saturation adjustment, you start to compound any issues that were there. Okay, so in this shot here, absolutely you can rescue, well, rescue is probably the wrong word, but we can pull up the detail in the sky and make it look genuinely really quite exciting. But if you push it too far, you're going to end up with artifacts that aren't great. So I'm a big fan of getting the most you can out of the dynamic range of the camera, and certainly in this case we've pulled up all those shadows, which is great. But if you push some of these highlights too far at the same time as trying to pull down those shadows, you're going to end up in a little bit of a sticky place as things start to look a bit odd. So, but overall, you know, these are fantastic locations and nice shots as well, Alan. So cool. This one here, we just got to be careful with those halos, and that's about it. So on to our next shot, which is Tony. So Tony, I think you posted this or a similar shot beforehand into Facebook from memory. So this is the previous, this is an edit. This is going to be a good candidate, and I'm just going to load it in just to show you for a fun time linear response curve. So let me just create a new variant. I'm going to go back to, oops, just reset that. So back to what came out of the camera. Now in this, I think Tony's removed a rock on the right hand side. We may have to do that a little bit later, and one here that was distracting, fine. So this is with the auto curve. Now, for those of you that have watched before, you'll remember what the auto curve has a habit of doing is taking things that are bright, making them a little bit brighter, and darker, making them a little bit darker, which is great on a standard image because it gives the effect of the image popping. But where we've got an image which has got a very big contrast change in it, so from this dark shadow here all the way up to the bright sky, you might find that a linear response curve gives us a lot smoother transition in those tones and some of those contrast points. So if I switch to a linear response, we see everything's gotten darker, but we haven't got the peaks of those highlights anymore. And this is going to give me a lot more latitude to be able to push this up further. So number one, I can pull my shadows a little bit. Number two, I can pull my black slider a touch. Again, not too much, not at the 100%, and so on. What that's doing is just from the raw, that's giving us a load of detail back on this rock that's out there, which is great. So I've got all the detail back without the sky going overblown, and without it pushing too far. So let's now have a look at what we can do with the rest of the shot in terms of its tone and clarity. So let's pull up clarity a bit. Now again, and we just demonstrate for you. If I push this too much, you see we get this halo here around this rock. If I pull this too low, we're going to end up with these weird ghosts around the rock as well. So this is the effect of doing the 100% plus and minus. So clarity and structure use in relative small doses, let's call it that. Typically, if I see a picture that's got more than somewhere between 25 and 40 on clarity, it's probably been a bit overcooked. So just be careful with these sliders. Just don't overdo them. I'm going to pull up structure a little bit, and the reason I'm pulling up structure is we've got a lot of detail, a lot of texture in these rocks, and where clarity is going to pull up the area of the rock and make that area more bold and more contrasty, what structure is going to do is look at the individual textures within the rock and the edges and the lines and so on, and just make them a little bit bolder. So if I undo temporarily and redo, we can see we've got a bit of a contrast boost, but it's not overdone. Now, one of the questions that Tony had, I think from memory, was about the white balance on these shots. Now, we've got two choices. One is to stick to, let's say, what was shot. So that's the white balance the camera decided. It was obviously an auto white balance. If we were at a sunset or a sunrise sort of situation, then sometimes the auto white balance on the camera can get it wrong. So we've got to go back to our memory. We've got to get back to what we remember seeing. And to me, I'm probably in a place where this needs to be a little warmer. Maybe not quite that much. Like that. And I'm going to pull down my highlights just a little bit as well, just to keep that color where it was. I can afford, with this shot, to pull some level changes in. So we can afford to darken. And actually going back to that midpoint slider, so let's use it live so you can see. Here's my midpoint of my levels tool. Now, as I move the highlights down and the shadows up, that midpoint is going to move proportionately to keep it in the middle of the data. If I want to override it, so I want more dark stuff, well, I pull this slider to the right. And it's shifting the proportion effectively, if you think about it that way, of dark stuff to be greater than the proportion of light stuff. If I move it to the left, we're going to increase the proportion of light areas of the histogram. So we're pushing that stuff to the right, and we're reducing the amount of dark stuff in the histogram on the left. So it's not the same as pulling up our black level or our white level. It's about that mix in the middle. And if you think about it in those terms, it sort of helps. So this here on the left controls at what point your image begins to clip to zero. So in other words, at what point black introduces. On the right hand side, we're deciding at what point the white level introduces. So at what point in the image 255 becomes 255. And at this scenario, we've said anything brighter than 234, treat it as if it's 255. So push it up brighter. This bit in the middle controls, and if we look at the histogram up here on the top left, the bit in the middle controls where the data in between those 2 points sits. And I can shift stuff left and right. So we can make this whole image look moodier by shifting it to the right, so more dark stuff in the image. Or I can make the image look a lot more bright and happy and so on by shifting it to the left and having more of the highlights brought out. That's now my choice, and I've got control over it. In this HDR sense, there's not much point in doing much with the whites because there's nothing really that sits up here in the highlights area. What there is worth, or what it is worth considering, is using our exposure to just pull down a little bit, and then maybe we just pull up the shadows. So I'm having the effect of flattening. I'm pulling down some of our overall exposure, but at the same time I'm lifting the shadows, just the shadows, not the blacks. I'm leaving those where they are to give us some contrast, but I'm lifting the shadows, so in other words this rock, so I can see it a bit clearer. A couple of questions. So JD, crank it to 11. One day there might be a pro, maybe there needs to be, actually, if David's still online, there needs to be a pro mode in Capture One where you can hit 11 instead of 10 or 110%. Prasad just said, any thought on using levels to stretch the histogram towards the highlights? That's exactly what we do. But on this one in particular, I don't really want to push it that far. If I do, it starts to become quite difficult to look at. It's really bright up here, and I think that's probably pushing it too far. We could probably get away with there. Yeah, that's probably okay, but I wouldn't push it too much further. So Alan, oh, from Brad to Alan, I'm curious as to why you chose to shot those, or sorry, chose to shoot those shots at ISO 200 using native ISO. Alan, you may you may have to answer that one because I don't know your decision on that. But in general, to give you sort of my view on it, I tend to shoot at the lowest ISO that is practical. It's not the same as lowest ISO that is possible. We're talking about the lowest ISO which is practical. And that can depend on whether something's moving or whether I've got time or whether I'm worried about shutter shake, the camera and so on. But in general terms, we might need to get Alan's view on what he did with that image. And Lucas, I'm guessing, is your name. So what's the approach for sharpening? Things looking overly crisp and digital. Yeah, absolutely. So if I go back to the image that we started with here, one of the issues, if you remember up on this top left, as I said, we had a bit of an over sharpening issue. There's still a couple of tweaks we could make on here. But in general, if we over sharpen an edge, you're going to see those digital artifacts around the outside. You're going to see those halos and sharp bits. It'll look fine when you're zoomed out. And it's one of the problems that we have quite often now, which is we're used to seeing and consuming images on a tiny little screen. And those tiny screens are great when you're zoomed out. But the second you see something like this printed big and you see all those artifacts, it can become a bit distracting. So sharpening is an art in itself, but generally I would always sharpen for print and then use potentially some of the output recipes in Capture One, and we can cover them in another session, but use the output recipes to be able to control the amount of sharpening that's going into a smaller image size rather than the full print. So yeah, to me, this feels like it should be a bit moodier than just too bright and happy. So let's have a little look at what we can do with our crop. At the moment, it's a 2x3 crop. I'm tempted to move it into almost a medium format crop, which is 3x4. That's going to fill the frame a bit more, and there are some arguments on what we can do in terms of whether this sits on the 1/3 line or a spiral and whatever else. But in reality, we're going to pick the crop that works better for your eye and the one that you think sits correctly. Now in here, I think Tony had already done this, but we're just going to do it quickly again on the raw. So I'm just going to use our healing brush top there with our little Band-Aid logo. Choose a little size that's going to suit. And we're going to draw a new healing layer, and it's going to get rid of that rock and get rid of that bump at the same time. Let's have a little look. I think you'd remove these two over here as well, Tony. So on these two, yeah, so Capture One's picking the right area, which is good. So the heal brush is working. And remember on the heal brush, once I just draw, it's going to create a new heal layer. Great. The second I draw another little red spot, it's going to work out where to take the origin. If it gets the origin wrong, so let's say Capture One had done this, that's going to look wrong. You can always pick the origin up by moving your mouse over the circle and choosing a different piece to pick up. Okay. So those are the same changes made in there. The natural shot in this, and if I go back to the before and after, we do have this weird change between the blue and the pink and the sky. So I'm not afraid of keeping that in. It's quite a nice split tone. If anything, we could possibly push our saturation just a couple of notches up. Again, not to 100, but let's just pull it up by a reasonable amount just to keep that going. And then I am tempted to use a little bit of a curve adjustment. So the curve, we may go into this a bit more detail at some point, but the curve gives us a lot more localized control over effectively the same as what levels will do. What levels allow us to do is control the top and the bottom and the midpoint. Curves allows us to place anchors at certain points on the histogram and have a lot more granular control over different aspects of that same data. So if I do a before and after with the curve, we go from there to there. All I've done is just made it pop a little bit more by taking this point here, the midpoint here, which actually is this area here. So all of this light here, this light here, and I can see that because if I look over here on my histogram and on the curve, as I move my mouse around, you see where this orange bar is moving. That's the bit that we're lifting by pushing that line up a little bit. Francois just asked, why do you avoid to use the contrast slider here? Because you have a lot of place on the right of the histogram. Because the contrast slider is a very dumb tool, is the answer. If it is designed for a perfect histogram, and if you want to stretch contrast from the middle, it'll do that. But what it will do is it will make everything left of middle darker and everything right of middle brighter. I don't want an image to just use that sort of blunt instrument that says, right, get brighter, get darker. It's the little changes, it's the little tweaks and little adjustments that make something a little more interesting and keeps the details more importantly. Where are we? Brian's just said, yeah, so we'll cover curves actually. So hopefully next week when the internet's being a bit more behaved, I blame Black Friday sales and Thanksgiving, but there we go. We'll try and do a session that's got a lot more intro into curves rather than levels. So levels, again, great stuff can be done in it. It's great for stretching a histogram, but that's what it's designed to do, either stretching or compressing. But it's still quite blunt. Nowhere near as blunt as contrast, but it is still effectively a 3 variant tool. Curves we can do a lot more with, and actually if I'd done that curve change with Luma rather than with RGB, we can change brightness without adjusting colors, which is another element of this, because if we do a color change, so if I look at this histogram here, we can see here the blue channel is much more enriched to the right. The green and red channels are much more enriched to the left. So as I'm making changes to this part of the hump in the histogram, I'm going to be affecting the blue channel more than I am the red, because there's more blue there to start with, for example. But let's do that. So in one of the upcoming sessions, we'll cover curves in a lot more detail. Okay. So that's sort of where I get to. So this is Tony's edit here from the raw. And if I look back to the raw and look to there, it just feels a bit harsh. I don't get the mood with the shot, whereas if I get into here, it just feels a bit nicer to my eye. And again, it's my eye, not yours. It may be wrong in that sense. All of the changes I've made have been done on the background layer. I could pull brightness up a little bit if I wanted to, but I'd then try and probably protect those highlights a little bit more. So yeah, that's sort of where I'd leave it with that one on there, Tony. I think you asked a question as well about removing rocks at some point. I don't think removing those ones on the side is a bad thing. If anything, if there's a distraction creeping in the corner of a print, then I'd just be careful of faking reality for sure. Be very careful and very wary of that. If you've got a distraction on the edge of a print and it's temporary in nature, I wouldn't have a problem with removing those. Right, Burns shot. So the question that came in was how to get the best out of the dynamic range on this shot. Now, let's start with what we're not going to do. So what we are absolutely not going to do, in fact, let's just start with a lens profile. So we don't have the lens profile loaded in. So I'm just going to get the chromatic aberration done and turn on our diffraction correction, which hopefully is going to sharpen a couple of bits up. Okay. What we're not going to do to get the best out of the dynamic range is this, because it's horrible, and we all know that. So the reason that we're not going to do that is because it's not possible for the camera to have seen that, and it's actually completely away from reality. But what these sliders do allow us to do by doing the plus and minus 100 is to see the detail and data that's really there. Of course, I could do it with exposure. So if I want to see what's in the shadows, I can pull exposure up. It's going to hurt our eyes up there. If I want to see what's in the highlights, I can pull our exposure down and we can see how much detail we actually have in the sun. So that's all good. Now it's a case of trying to do that in a subtle way. So in this shot, we know from pulling up that exposure, this camera's got a good amount of dynamic range in it. It's actually recorded all of this stuff in the shadow with very little noise, if any. So great job on that. Let's see what we can do with it. So let's just reset our exposure. I can pull up. Now, if I use and I'm going to remind those people that have been on here for a while, it's the same thing that I've said a few times. Remember that your mouse is able to tell you a lot of things. So up here, it's telling me the number, the level of each of the red, green, and blue channels wherever I move the pointer. But on the left in the histogram, it's telling me where these elements sit. So these clouds are sat in the highlights. This tree is sat not just in the shadows, but actually in the black area. So you've got blacks, the bottom part of the shadows, then the shadows, the bottom, 20%, let's call it that. Then the midtones, middle 50, and then the highlights, the top 20 to 25%, and then the whites, which is the very top 5%, so the top end of highlights. This tree sits in the black area of the histogram, not just in the shadows. This grass sits in the black area of the histogram, not just the shadows. If I pull up our shadows, we're going to get this effect. If I pull up the blacks, we get this effect. It's a slight difference, so let's just show you. So let's clone that variant, and this one, instead of black, I'm going to pull up shadows. Now you see, by pulling up blacks, we haven't touched any of the other shadowy areas, any of the other dark areas of the image. We've only pulled up the darkest parts of the shot. If I pull up shadows, then I'm pulling up not just the black, but I'm also pulling up all of the other parts. The challenge is, you see here we've got a lot more detail in the tree, we've got a lot more detail in all of this grass stuff, and I've done that without brightening the whole image. If I pull up shadow, I have to pull this a long way up to be able to see all that content. And the reason is because it's got to drag those blacks all the way up out of the shadow area and into the midtones to be able to see some of the detail in here. So we can get to the same amount of detail, but it's not as localized as the black high dynamic range correction. Same with highlights and whites. So as I pull down the highlights, it is including the whites in the image. But if I just pull down the whites, it's pulling down just those white areas, the brightest parts of the histogram. It's just pulling those down in isolation and leaving the highlights relatively alone. So in this shot here, in order to pull up all of this information, if I just use the shadow slider, I've got to pull it up a long way, and we know what happens when we get to 100%. If I use the black slider, I don't have to pull it up by as much. And if I want to, I can still pull up shadows a little bit, and I can still get to the same place, but without having launched and lifted all of the other content of the rest of the shot as well. Okay, where are we? Let me just think what I was going to say. Rotation. Let's just fix that. This hill may be on. This field may be on a hill. The tree is upright. Now here's the problem. If I do this, now my tree is leaning. That doesn't quite make sense. But the field is level. So I've got a bit of a problem here, and this is where the rotation tool is not going to help me, because the rotation tool is going to tilt the whole image so everything goes in as one. Instead, and we've done this a couple times recently, I'm going to use Keystone. So Keystone allows me to keep that where it is, but to pull down this right-hand side to be more level. So if I hit apply now, I can keep the tree where it is. So we're not having the tree lean over completely, but I have managed to get the ground to be nice and level. Maybe not quite so much. Let's just undo there. Good. And on my crop, I'm going to go to original. So we're not going to change the crop from what it was shot at. Again, from a print point of view, think about this tree. It's either going to be in completely or out completely. What I don't want to see is half a tree. That always bugs me when I see that on the edge of a print. So if anything, we could afford to probably get rid if we wanted to. So we could probably come into there. That looks a bit neater. Yeah, actually a lot neater. So yeah, Earl's just said when you use the shadow slider, it looks washed out. Yeah, so the shadow and the highlights, there was a good introduction. It came in version 20, I think, from memory, but the introduction of the black and white slider separately to highlights and shadows. Before, you used to have to pull the whole batch of highlights down or the whole batch of shadows up. Now you've got those little finer adjustments at the end. So the black slider and the white slider allows us to just be able to tweak it a little bit with a more refined manner. So from there, we've got a bit of an oversaturation in my head on the green, which may not actually be a saturation issue. It may just be that I want to warm up the scene a touch by bringing in a custom white balance there. That looks pretty nice. Now I'm just going to add a new layer, and we're going to call that one Sky. And you can probably guess what I'm going to do. I'm just going to put in a little grad filter. I'm not sure if a graduated filter was used on this shot. If it was, I'm just going to pump it a little bit more. So now I've got a shot which is balanced, more evenly balanced than it started out, but it's looking a bit dark. So there's a couple of ways I can fix this. Let's go back to our background, or I could do a filled layer. So a filled layer means everything on it and below is going to be affected by this. I can pull up our brightness for the shot. Brightness, remember, has an effect of flattening the image. I can pull up our exposure, which pulls up all the values. It doesn't flatten the image, it keeps the same amount of contrast, but it has a risk of pushing off our highlights, often to being overblown. Or I can use the levels tool. So if I use the levels tool and maybe shift that midpoint, just like we talked about before, so more of the bright stuff, less of the dark stuff, we can do that to pull this up without losing much contrast. And if I were to lose any contrast, well, all I've got to do is just pull the outside ones closer together, which effectively stretches that histogram. So we get our darks getting darker, our whites getting whiter, and the middle bit being told to introduce more light areas of the image than dark. And that's how we get the effect of brightening. Sorry. Oh, he's still on the screen. Sorry, you're now gone. So Dan's just asked, what is the difference between using the black and white slider versus curves and make similar adjustments? So here's a little secret. Most of the stuff in these sliders can be done in curves. You can adjust contrast in a curve. You can adjust, actually, you can adjust saturation to a certain extent by playing with certain levels of certain colors in the curve. You can do most of you can achieve most of the tool elements with curves and with a color editor as well on the side. So in terms of using the blacks and the white sliders, I can achieve it by using a curve. So if I wanted to pull up, let's say the black, let's just anchor this curve so I'm not affecting anything in the midtones. And with our black slider, I can pull up the brightness of it, and I'm doing it over the top intentionally, don't worry, but I can pull up just the blacks there, or I can crush them down by a little curve adjustment. I can do the same in the highlights area, so I can pick on this little section up here, which is the highlights, and I can make them brighter or I can make them darker. There's not much in this shot that's going to do that. I can dim down the amount that a highlight is, but it can all be done in the curve if you want to. It's just a bit messy, which is why some of these things have been exposed to make it easier. Okay, so let's have a look at what we can do with other stuff. So this shot here, pretty much finished. What I would be tempted to do is just to pull down that sky a little bit more now. So a little bit more of an exposure pull down. And now let's look at before and after. So there was our shot that we were worried that we wouldn't be able to get all of the detail back in from. And there's our final shot. If we don't like it, if it's too much, then we can always back some of these sliders away. But in general terms, that's what you can get away with naturally. If we try to do that unnaturally, so let's just reset this shot and just do it with high dynamic range. So pull down highlights, pull down whites, pull up shadows, pull up blacks, we go cartoony. This to me is a natural shot compared to what just the HDR sliders will do. So it's all about trying to do it in tiny little detail changes, tiny little adjustments. Those adjustments cumulatively will have a big effect. But if you just try and do it by using the sort of, bang, bang, bang on 3 or 4 sliders, you're going to end up in a place where the image just doesn't look real. So be really careful. Okay, next week we will start with probably some of Ernst's images, so one of these or one of these, we'll start that. Hopefully the connection will be better next week, so I'm sorry to everyone that struggled with it. It's a bit weird where some people have got a fine connection, some people don't. Normally it's global, it's global. But hopefully it's got a little bit better for you guys over time. We'll put the replay up. It'll be on the Facebook group, so go across to there. You'll find the replay of this, which will be complete and up there, including all the apologies at the start. And of course, remember there's competition winners. So genuinely well done. So Nars got that style pack coming his way. It was a great edit out in that field. Peter's done a wonderful job with that rock pool and the canyon in there. So he's got the version 21 upgrade heading to him. And because David and I couldn't decide, Noel also has a version 21 upgrade. So well done to you three. In fact, well done to U9, the top 9 as it were, and well done to everyone that sent one in, because we didn't find one that wasn't edited with a lot of care and attention in it, so genuinely well done. In the meantime, before Thursday next week, we'll be back on same time, same place, but you can obviously access all of those pro tips things. In there are things on sharpening, for those that were asking about it, as well as things like contrast improvements and clarity and what they do. Don't forget to send in your uploads in the meantime, using that tool. Please include your name as well as the raw file, not just a flattened TIFF, so we know who we're dealing with. And we will catch you in about a week. And in the interim, have a good Thanksgiving to those of you that are doing that stuff. And don't kill anyone over a 65-inch TV in Walmart for those of you that are heading out for Black Friday. Cool. Catch you later. Bye.